Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. Mr. Lewis here, ready to go through another section of urban geography in AP HuG today as we continue our study of cities. And today we're going to look at section 9.5, the internal structure of cities. And we're going to do that by learning about a few different models that were developed throughout the early and middle parts of the 1900s in an attempt to explain and predict urban growth. The first model that we're going to look at, which is also the earliest of these models, is called the concentric zone model, sometimes referred to as the Burgess model. And in the Burgess model, we have, as the name would suggest, these concentric circles starting with the city center, which is the central business district, or what we sometimes call the CBD. This is the focal point of this model, the central business district. Now, the first ring around the CBD is what we call the factory zone. This is for manufacturing. The second ring gets into the transitional zone between commercial and residential. Then we get into the first residential zone, known as the working class zone. The fourth ring would be suburban areas. And then finally, the commuter zone, called the commuter zone because people have to commute into the city center. Now, this model is actually very similar to von Thunen's model, which we took a look at in section 7, unit 7, agricultural geography. It's similar in that as we move from the central business district to the outer edges, not only do we have more land to work with as we get to the outer circles, but also the population gets lower and we get farther away from the market, the central business district. So that's important to keep in mind when it comes to things like range and threshold, which we learned about with central place theory in section 9.4. Now, later on, we get the development of what's called the Hoyt sector model. And this is similar to the Burgess model, but there's a huge emphasis on income as a key determinant in these patterns and processes of residential development and settlement. So the Hoyt sector model doesn't just put things into concentric zones. We have what are called sectors. They kind of look like this shape here. It's like a big wedge. And usually these are formed on some kind of pathway, like a road or a river or maybe a railway or something like that. And what I'd like you to do is pause this video for a second and see if you can predict which items, which categories go with each of these 5 colors as they are represented in the Hoyt sector model. So see if you can take a second and predict what each of these 5 things will be in the Hoyt sector model. And then play it again, and we'll go on to the next slide, and I'll show you. All right, let's take a look. In the Hoyt sector model, here's what we have. The center is still the central business district. That is still the focal point, right? But then things get a little different. We have these 2 big sectors that connect to the central business district in purple here that represent our industrial sectors, manufacturing, factories. But then also bordering the central business district and bordering the factory zones is the working class residential area. Then we get these big sectors along the edges here that are not connected to the central business district that represent middle class housing. And then finally, we have one wedge on the outside here, and you can see it's sticking out a little bit further than these suburban middle class areas. And what this represents is high income, sometimes an exurb area, right? Farther away from the central business district. So Hoyt's model is taking into account some of the things that we've actually already discussed in this class as it relates to urban development closer to the 21st century, closer to where we are today. And you can see some of the comparisons here between the Burgess model and the Hoyt model. One obvious one is the use of concentric circles or concentric zones in the Burgess model versus the sectors or wedges in the Hoyt model, but also the use of income as a key determinant is really significant in the Hoyt model, and that makes it stand apart from the Burgess model as well. Then we get one more model that's developed a little later on as we have continued urban development that argues there isn't just one focal point, there are multiple growth points. And this is the Harris and Ullman multiple nuclei model. And this was really driven by the advent of vehicles and the ubiquitous nature of cars, meaning all of a sudden they were everywhere and they were affordable. And this theory is used to explain why some of these large expanding cities like Los Angeles, for example, have many distinct neighborhoods, many distinct nuclei, and not just one focal point. So, Harris and Ullman's model looks a little bit like this, and you can see it's a lot messier. We don't have concentric zones anymore. We do have this central business district in blue. We've got some light manufacturing right next to the central business district, so that's pretty similar. Then we have working class residential areas next to the central business district. That's pretty similar. This giant green area is middle class residential, and then this pink area would be high income residential. The big difference comes in these little squares and rectangles. So this light green one at the bottom right here is a residential suburb. This could be considered an exurb in our terms, right? This little guy right here is a business district. So now we're getting the development of business districts outside of just the central business district, right? Then down here on the bottom left, we have some heavy manufacturing that's outside of the manufacturing next to the central business district. And then up here, this gray area represents an industrial suburb, a suburb near industrial activity. And so this is very different from what we saw in the previous two models. We have these multiple nuclei that are breaking up the models that Hoyt and Burgess had developed, which were based on one nucleus, right? One focal point. Instead, these have multiple focal points: industrial areas, manufacturing, business districts, things like that. And here's a comparison of the sector model to the nuclei model, and you can see those multiple nuclei kind of spread around there. And then all three of them together. And this is kind of interesting. We go from 1925 with Burgess's model when things were much more predictable, much simpler, and then by the late 30s, Hoyt's model is determining that income is a huge factor in urban patterns and urban development. And then finally, by the middle of the 1940s, Harris and Ullman realized it's not just one nucleus, it's not just one focal point. We're seeing the development of multiple focal points in these urban settings. And they were right. We've seen New York City develop in a very similar way. We've seen Los Angeles develop in a very similar way. And today, we have the development of the galactic city model. And what this represents, what this means, is that in the post-industrial era, these cities have developed into a network of cities, right? It's not just one focal point. There are multiple edge cities around the outskirts of an urban center that are economic powerhouses and have a lot of big businesses in their own right. And they create these transportation nodes, public transportation, that get people from those edge cities to the city center, the central business district. And so transportation is easy. We have multiple nuclei spread around this larger metropolitan area, and this has turned into what we call the galactic city model. Now, in a larger context, in the post-Ford era, in the era of vehicles, personal automobiles becoming quite common, we've seen the development of cities, the structure of cities go from a basic central business district with factories and warehouses and industrial activity, surrounded by working class communities, surrounded by middle class suburbs with railways coming in, to the development of interstate highway systems or urban beltways around the city, the breakdown of many industrial areas inside the city center, which leads to wasteland, more middle-class suburbs, but also exurbs and the development of many central business districts outside of the central business district that we started with, and some decentralized industries. Eventually, we get to what we have today. Large shopping centers on the outskirts of the urban center. Edge cities with lots and lots of business flowing and gated high-income communities. We also have on the edges of the cities some industrial suburbs and poor industrial areas. We have the development of gentrified enclaves in the city center, these refurbished areas that go from being wasted or unused or maybe decaying, or in some cases just a little bit out of date, to very modern and very swanky, expensive settings. And finally, where would we be without giant theme parks, right? Of course, we have the development of these big theme parks, attractions outside of the city center along the edges, outside of the urban beltway. And so it's kind of interesting to see where we start with the development of urban settings and where we've gotten to today. We're going to get into a little bit more later in the unit about gentrification, for example, and some of these other items that you see here, the global command center in the central business district, that kind of thing. But there's two other models that I'd like to leave you with today. One is the HuG model. The HuG model was developed to try and explain and predict the development of cities in Southeast Asia. And it's just a generalized model, right? And it's only one model. We don't have multiple to look at here like we did with the models that were based on American cities that I just showed you. But this is what we have with the HuG model. The focal point is a port zone, right? Along the coast somewhere, we have this very important central business district, essentially, which is a port zone. And then, beyond that, we get into commercial zones, both domestic and foreign. In Southeast Asia, there are a lot of core nations involved in this trade, but also we have China and India that have really come to dominate much of the trade in Southeast Asia. Then we get to the middle density residential zone. Finally, we have suburbs and squatter areas. Now, squatter areas are essentially very low income, impoverished settlements that some people refer to sometimes as slums. They are squatter settlements. We're going to talk more about squatter settlements later in this unit. Finally, we get the gardening zone and industrial areas. Notice too, along the edges of the port zone here, we have the government zone linked up right along the edge of the port zone. That's important. And then higher income areas that are separated from all of this mixed land use and commercial areas and more densely populated residential zones. In the Latin American city model, just a generalized model used to predict and explain the development of urban settings in Latin America, this is called the Griffin-Ford model. We have a central business district, but there are two key bridges in this big circular model from the central business district and the market. One goes to the industrial park, the other is a commercial spine that leads to a giant mall. Okay? Now, along this commercial spine, we have what they're calling the elite, which would be high income residential sector. Along the edges of that, we have the zone of maturity and some gentrified areas, right? But then we get into this transitional zone, and finally, more squatter settlements, these peripheral squatter areas. Okay, and these two wedges that you see connecting the squatter regions with the central business district are what are called disamenity zones. We're going to talk more about disamenity zones a little bit later in this unit as well, but essentially what it means is a lack of amenities, a lack of access to goods and services being the emphasis there, that people need. So there might be a lack of access to healthcare, for example. That's what a disamenity zone would be. So this is just an updated but still generalized model to explain the growth of and structure of Latin American cities. That's it for the internal structure of cities. There are no assignments to go with section 9.5. I think taking in all of those models alone is quite a bit. We're going to revisit those models as we review Unit 9, so don't worry. We're going to come back to them and go through those a lot more in depth, and then, of course, review them before the test. But that's all for today. Next week, we will dive into section 9.6, which gets into urban density and helps us understand a little bit more about the development of squatter settlements and disamenity zones. All right, thank you again for tuning in. You all have a great weekend. Bye.